Okay, so I just want to welcome everyone this evening to this webinar hosted by the Left Bank and Social Democrats. Everybody who's logging in is very welcome, and this is on a very important issue around tackling vacancy and dereliction in Ireland. We're really lucky to have Jude Cherry and Frank O'Connor from Anois, who are based in Cork, who've been doing a huge amount of work making dereliction and vacancy really visible. Mainly through their social media posts over the last while, and they've given great, they've really gotten the national discussion going on this. So we're really happy to have both of them. Actually, just want to, before we kick off, I want to just thank Jude and Frank for the work that they've been doing and highlighting this. It's really important, and it's great to see how people can, be a spark in terms of highlighting something and making stuff really visible to people that was already visible, bringing it to the fore. It's been really useful work to do. So just in terms of the structure for this evening, we're aiming for about an hour, give or take. So I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction, hand over to Jude and Frank, and they're going to give some introductory comments. And then I have a number of questions I just want to ask them and put to them, and then we're going to open up to any questions that are coming from participants. So there is a Q&A button there, and you can put in your questions and comments there, and we'll work our way through those. Just to start, I just want to say, as this is the first Left Bank and event of the year, I do want to extend on behalf of everyone involved in the Social Democrats our sincere sympathies to all the friends and family of Aisling Murphy, and say that there's a particular onus on all of us to do everything we can to tackle gender-based violence, and to do everything we can on that. And we will be doing that in terms of GDs. We'll be raising stuff in the Dáil from tomorrow. I know across the country we'll all be active in that. On tackling dereliction and vacancy, and just before Jude and Frank start, obviously, this is an issue that's very central to housing and housing supply and getting homes, put back into use that people can use. But there's a lot more to it than that. It is linked in with, safer cities, safer towns, good public realms, building really strong and cohesive communities. And dereliction and vacancy actually, goes against all of that. You can see in an area when one derelict or vacant building that might be really creating an eyesore on a street or whatever, when that gets put back into use, there's people living in it, it's renovated, you can see the transformative effect that can have on the entire street or indeed on the neighbourhood. So it is more about than just the housing element. There's also a huge factor in this in terms of our response to climate change. My view is that dereliction vacancy isn't an accident. It's really a policy choice. It's happened partially as a result of a lot of decisions that were made over the years in terms of having much more car-dependent development. It's not a coincidence, in my view, that a lot of housing policy, a lot of planning policy in Ireland was really led by the development industry and people, large developers, who are interested in building large, developments outside of towns, and had much less interest in ensuring that vacant homes, in towns or in urban centres, or homes already built were renovated. So there are, I think, connections to that. Jude and Frank and others working in this area, they often say that the most sustainable building is an existing building, and all the stats around carbon and carbon emissions absolutely bear that out. But also the point of that if you're putting an existing building that's already in a cluster or in an urban setting or a town back into use, that is obviously that's more conducive to walking, cycling, people living near other amenities, and it's less dependent on on car dependency and so forth. So I think that's a very important part of this. The Irish Green Building Council have said, for example, that carbon emissions from construction process account for about 11% of our national carbon emissions. So, the more we can do to use existing buildings rather than having to entirely rely on new buildings, is hugely important. Just before I hand over to Jude and Frank, I want to say as well that one of the reasons we're holding this seminar to give people chance to ask questions and raise points and learn more about this, but we also very much want to encourage people into action or activism or activity in your local area on this. And that might just mean taking a photo of a derelict and vacant building, putting it up on social media, or trying to find out, is it on the Derelict Sites Register if it's derelict, or if not, why not? Or, but try and take some small actions like that. Jude and Frank have done massive work on this. And one of the great things we've seen over particularly the last number of months, I think, is we're seeing other people in other parts of the country beginning to do this as well. So if all of us do even a little bit of that, just to amplify the work that's been done, we don't all have to do it on the scale that Jude and Frank have done it. I don't think that would be possible for us, but if we can do a bit to add into that, I think that would be really, really useful. So we'd very much encourage people to do that, and we can maybe discuss a bit of that more. So just hand you over to Jude and Frank for some introductory comments, and then we'll move on to some questions.
Thank you, Cian, and hello to everyone. It's great to be here this evening having a conversation about something that I suppose has taken over our lives over the last 3 years. For context, we moved back to Ireland, to Cork City, late 2018. And when we came back, we'd fallen in love with the city, but we were shocked by the levels of dereliction, vacancy, decaying heritage, homelessness, and the housing crisis. So we'd been abroad for a number of decades, and we developed a lot of skills working all over the world. And we decided to apply our skills in Ireland to see if we could make a contribution. So we basically kind of had a 3-stage process. One is shine a light. So what we did with shining a light was very much about a social media campaign. So we started on the 24th of June 2020, and we posted one property in Cork, a derelict property, and we started a conversation about social crime, social contract, homelessness, housing crisis, and we carried that on for a whole year, which became a daily dose of dereliction. In the meantime, in parallel, what we started to do was build up the data. So basically, we shine a light and we challenge, and we use the data to challenge. So in parallel, while I was focusing on the social media, Jude was looking through the data and focused on 340 properties, and that's where the This is Derelict Ireland report came, which we launched about a year ago. So that was very much, the data was debunking the myths around dereliction and saying it is possible to end dereliction. Other countries have done it, why can't we? And there was a lot of myths we were getting back through social media. And then the third phase was very much about showing what's possible. So you shine a light, you challenge, and then you show what's possible. And show what's possible is very much around the idea of rest, play, work. We believe all urban environments should have a kind of a rest, play, work model where everyone has a home, everyone has somewhere to play, and everyone has access to work. And so from that, we started producing different, I suppose, possibilities for buildings in Cork, maybe for creative spaces, community spaces, turning them back into homes. So that's kind of the overall process. And then from that, I suppose, the foundation of what we do, we come from a very strong sustainability point of view. So a very strong, sustainable and ethical basis to everything we do. We were keen to build a community, and that was our I suppose, objective from the outset. We didn't know anyone in Ireland when we moved back other than family, so we didn't have a network or anything. So the social media campaign was very much about getting to know people and building community, and then handing over ownership to other people and helping them to get set up. So we wanted other communities to start doing it as well. And thankfully that happened about a year ago, and that's happened, grown and grown as well. So it's happening all over Ireland now. So the community was very important for us, but also not just the social media and the data and the kind of reports on rest, play, work. We also wanted to get out in the streets. So we started introducing a very simple technique called walk and talk. So we basically invited people who were interested to meet us in the city and to walk around and start looking and understanding what the dereliction vacancy meant for us and for them. And then we also introduced walking festivals in dereliction, which we ran 2 last year in partnership with CATU, the Tenants Union, and also Reclaim Our Spaces in Dublin. And so we ran one in Cork and one in Dublin. So that's kind of the overall process. And then in terms of results, I mean, I suppose, we wanted to start a conversation on dereliction. We'd done our research and we realized there was bar a few sources. I mean, David McWilliams are covered in the podcast a few times. The Examiner had run a few articles, and there was a few other bits and pieces, but generally dereliction is something that's been ignored. And we were doing our initial research. We weren't quite sure if we focused on which aspect, but the fact that dereliction would be normalized as far as we were concerned. And we'd lived in other countries and had just moved from Amsterdam to Cork, and a lot of similarities between the cities. But Amsterdam had tackled dereliction in the 70s and 80s, so we knew it was possible to do something about it. So in terms of results, we've been overwhelmed, particularly on a community basis. We're both very interested in obviously community-based activism. So to see it growing and growing, but also see the media coverage. If you look at the media now, it's very hard to get away any week from whether it's TV or radio or print, where there's conversations about dereliction. So really, I suppose that accumulated for us with the Oireachtas presentation in December. I know that Cian was a part of that, and also featuring on the news. It was very important to get that message out to the wider audience. So I suppose we're now in a place where we're continuing with a lot of that work, but also looking at other ways that we can empower other citizens in Ireland to say that we all have a role to play. We want people to look up, see what's around them, appreciate it, and turn our wonderful towns and cities with so much undervalued heritage and so much dereliction and decay, turn them around and bring families, everyone from an 8 to an 8-year-old, back into those environments. So I suppose our bigger interest, Jude and I, is very much on the sustainability, the livability, and bringing families and basically equality and social justice. So I think dereliction has been a means for us to get that conversation out there.
Thanks, Frank, and thanks very much for those introductory comments. I think it's worth mentioning that report you mentioned that you've done. This is Derelict Ireland. For anyone who hasn't looked at it, I think they can just find it by Googling it. It's on your website. Is it on the Anois website?
It's not on the website, but no, our website's very, very simple. But I'm guessing if you Google this is Derelict Ireland.
Ireland, I think people will find it. Yeah, I think they will. It's very, very good because it's exceptionally clear, and it actually demolishes all the kind of arguments and myths that have been put up over the years about, oh, you can't do this and so forth.
That came about from, I suppose, all the conversations on Twitter and social media, is that people were coming back to us with all the reasons why when we started initially posting, and we were like, oh, okay, well, I suppose because we've worked a lot in research, like Frank led an international research centre in the UK on eco-design, so we have those research skills, and we work a lot with policymakers, so we were able to go, well, actually, what is the reality here? We're hearing all these reasons, and so I suppose we're able to use then the report to demit 10 of the major ones that came out of the data. So it's, yeah.
And I suppose because we work in sustainability, I for over 30 years, Jude for 20, we're used to facing brick walls, so it was just another challenge, I mean, people, cultural change and mindset, and that was important for us too. So all the resistance to our work initially was very helpful, because it helped us to persevere, but also helped us to get to the root of it. And I think with the report, like you say, Cian, we've had great feedback from that, because we took a very much a design-led approach to it. So we tried to make the report accessible for everyone, and I suppose that's the feedback we've got. And also in terms of building the community as well, we took a deliberate decision not to personalize our approach, because we feel it's a systems failure. I mean, there's for us to target individuals wasn't the useful way to do it. So taking that systems perspective, I think, was very, very important for us. And also reaching out to different communities, which is very important as well, because you mentioned in your opening, I mean, it affects all of us, and that was one of the reasons we started as well, is that we got friendly with someone who was without a home in Cork, and he was a lovely man, and he was the same age exactly as me. And also we ourselves were getting affected from a mental health point of view, well-being, by walking around and seeing all the dereliction and the decay. And it was something that I suppose we felt we had to act on.
That's a very interesting comment you made, that you found the resistance actually useful. You turned something that could have been negative into a positive in terms of campaigning on this, and that's a really helpful way in terms of looking at any kind of issue or campaign. And it is true that people they're presenting you with the arguments that need to be answered or need to be demolished in order to get more people on board. So that's a exceptionally positive way of looking at things. but I think very, very useful. Just to ask then, in terms of what you think can be done quickly to address vacancy and dereliction, what are the kind of quicker things that can be done?
Yeah, so it is, I suppose the beauty is we do have an ability to, I suppose, first of all, we can end dereliction. Other countries have ended it, so we do know we can end it. So it is tackleable. So one of the biggest myths we kept getting was that we need new legislation. We can't do anything with the current legislation we have. And actually, when we went through the Derelict Sites Act, we found that actually local authorities have a lot of power under that. Now, it's not perfect and there are a lot of challenges with it, but actually what we are calling for is for local authorities to, first of all, register all derelict properties. Now, the GR directory is released today that there's probably about 22,000 derelict homes only across Ireland. So we'd like all those to be, we know the addresses now, they have the geo addresses, so we'd like all of those to be registered straight away. We also know that there's a lot more derelict commercial properties all across Ireland as well, so we don't have the full data on where all those are, and so they need to be mapped and recorded and registered on the derelict registry, and then we can get a full picture of the dereliction scale of dereliction across Ireland and where exactly it is. And that means then also that if we bring in measures like grants or additional taxes, we have the data that they can work off on. So for instance, Darren Murphy was talking about bringing in a grant of 30k for buyers of derelict properties, but actually Pascal for revenue said that it was too difficult for them to manage because they don't know where the derelict properties are. But if we were able to register them all straight away, we think that could be done within a year. If the proper resources were given to the local authorities. We done it, we shared one image every day of nearly 450 properties. This is just us walking around our streets. So if we can do it as citizens quite quickly in that regard, then in our spare time, a properly resourced local councils can do it very, very quickly. And that means getting on the streets, that means walking the areas and probably going also more rurally as well. What we also have in Ireland that is not being fully enforced either is building control and building regulations. So unfortunately in Cork, we have a lot of buildings that are falling down. And this is quite unusual to us moving back here. It's not usual for us to be worried about buildings falling on you as you're walking the streets of your city. So that's something that needs to be urgently tackled now. The council here has refused to do a risk survey of buildings, but that's pretty typical across Europe, and we don't think would take a huge amount of time. Again, if someone's mapping dereliction, they can map the buildings at risk at the same time. Is there buildings that need to be fixed up and repaired just to make sure that they're safe for everybody structurally and for the public as well, using public spaces. So there are things that we have the capacity to already do. We have the laws already in place. And then also things like the council addressing their own voids and derelict properties. So to bring, we've seen a couple of days ago, there's about 4,000 vacant council-owned homes. There's no excuse for that in a housing crisis. We need to bring all those back up, and that's whether the responsibility lies with the Department of Housing or the local councils. Those houses need to be brought back into use as quickly as possible. So there are things that can be done quickly. There's no reason why it can't be. It's just a case of getting the resources into the right place. And another thing that we've called for is meanwhile use of all publicly owned vacant buildings. So this is something that we've done some research with the Heritage Council, with Ali Harvey on the CHTC, sorry, pronouncing it wrong.
CTCHC
program that's looking at town centres. So we think there's a opportunity, what we call a laboratoire, which is a hotbed of innovation. So this is quite normal across Europe as well, is that when buildings become vacant, instead of leaving them vacant for a very long time, you get communities into them, you get creative uses of them, or business startups or innovation uses, and you can use those buildings and make sure that they're maintained, make sure that they're being used. So from a community and a local environment perspective, there's still people around, there's still life in the area. And that means that we can use those spaces creatively and innovatively to tackle some of the challenges around livability in our city. So that's something we'd like to see a lot more of. So there are a few other measures, but they're the main ones that we think that can happen really quickly, that we have the laws in place, and it's just a case of allocating proper resources and really prioritizing that, both in our national state departments and in the local authorities.
Thanks. And it is, when you look at the Derelict Sites Act, it's actually a very readable piece of legislation. It's very clear, it's very strong, it gives local authorities very strong powers in terms of putting any building that is derelict, and it defines that as one that, you know, detracts from the visual amenity of neighbouring properties or neighbouring land or whatever. So it's quite a broad definition. You know, anything that any of us would, in a day-to-day sense, would consider derelict by just looking at it, would fit into that definition. There's no question about that. So that could be used, if it's put on the register, then it could be subject to a levy. And indeed, the councils can use a compulsory purchase order as well to buy it if the landowner or the property owner isn't going to do anything with it. I remember years ago I was involved in a campaign with some other people in Dublin, where we were looking to utilise a kind of a derelict building, and we got the list of derelict buildings off Dublin City Council. And we were walking around different places in and around, not far from city centre, looking at the list, and we actually, a good number of them had been CPO'd, and a good number of them, because the council had threatened to CPO them, were then renovated and so forth, and they were quite active at that. They then stopped that. They're back to doing some CPOs again more recently. But we were able to find on our list one derelict building that we were able to, on Parnell Square, they were then able to open up as a community space temporarily. But
and then that's, I mean, like, for us, we feel very passionate about that element, because you know our cities and towns will survive with strong communities, and I think a lot of that's being lost in Ireland. And like, we fall in love with Cork City, and it's a wonderful place to live, and it's beautiful people here and stuff, but there's so few spaces for people to come together, you know, and at a community level, at a creative level. When we did our walk and talks, we started meeting people, taking for walks around the city. The amount of people from different backgrounds that contacted us to come with us, who were all looking for spaces to set up some nice projects on a local level and stuff. And there was nowhere for people to go. And even for us as creatives, we've struggled to get spaces as well.
Even trying to rent spaces, it's not that people are looking for free spaces, they're looking to rent spaces, and they're just not available, even though there's empty spaces and derelict spaces all over the place.
yeah, and that survey you're talking about, the town centre survey that the Heritage Council have done, I mean, that showed in Dundalk that there was 24% vacancy on commercial ground floors. And a lot of this is connected with kind of taxation, because if something is opened and in use, it's been charged full commercial rates. If it's vacant, it may not be getting taxed at all, and that's getting changed now, so there'll be some level of rates levied. But I found in some areas where there's a lot of vacancy, actually getting the council to make sure that the properties are rated and that there's some rates applied to create that incentive to get them into use. You know, that's a challenge to try and get that done. And you know, of course, if we could get that also then incentivizes meanwhile uses, because if you own a building and you have to pay rates on it and it's not in use, at least if you can get a cheap rent in, that might cover your rates.
Absolutely.
And, you know, for community use or artistic use or whatever, while you're figuring out what you're going to do.
Exactly. I mean, there's projects that, like, you see in Ireland, there has been minimal use, but it's often been very short term. But actually, the more successful schemes overseas have been quite long term. Like this sites in Cork, this sites in Dublin, as we know, and right across the country, which have been maybe vacant for 5-10 years. You know, buildings, etc. And like, the opportunity to get people in has all those benefits, but also on the local economy, job creation, and just the well-being. So
in the likes of Scotland, they have a program called Stalled Spaces, but they also, and in the Netherlands as well, they have programs called Broodplaatsen, which is about breeding spaces. And what they do is work with the developers, because it could take a long time. If we take, say, the example of the Cork Docklands, they've just put in planning now for a 10-year plan for offices and apartments and other uses of spaces. They have that particular developer has planning just a few sites up for offices that they said they're not going to build those offices until they rent out their current vacant offices. So we could be like, that could be a 10-year before building starts on Cork Docklands. And what normally would happen is those spaces would be opened up for meanwhile use in that temporary term. And so you come up with agreements with the developers that you use the space for a certain amount of time, and just before it's ready to start building, then you move out. Or you move out slowly, or some move out and move on to another space. So we have plenty of spaces all around the country that's lying waiting for development that should be used creatively and should be used to the benefit of the local economy and the local communities, but in collaboration with the developers and the local authorities.
And that could be inside space, but also outside spaces as well. You know, I mean, in Cork City, which we know the best, obviously, there is a huge shortage of green spaces. There's a shortage of play spaces for kids. There's a shortage of spaces for teenagers. I mean, there's so many spaces we need, whether indoor or outdoor. So we're kind of just missing a trick. And I suppose we are beginning to touch, I suppose, in the conversation on some of the cultural challenges, which I suppose we didn't recognize fully till we moved back. And so it's really, I suppose, there are cultural challenges around people's understanding of that cities are places where people are happy to live in. And people like us love living in city centres. And that's why we moved here. And when we came back, people were like, well, why would you want to move to city centre? Why would we want to move to Blackpool where we live? And we love industrial heritage as well. So I think there are cultural barriers that probably hopefully we'll all begin to talk about more in the coming years and begin to address, and realize that families also can live very happily in city centres.
So I suppose if we want everyone to move back into it, to move into apartments, especially for families to move into apartments or smaller units, they only work not only if the internal space is designed, so good storage, good lighting, good balconies or good outside space, but also the space around them needs to be designed for families and be designed for livability. So play areas, right outside your door, and not a 15-minute or 20-minute walk away. You need to be able to walk and cycle very safely to places. So like in Amsterdam, kids cycle to school from secondary school onwards on their own. So in the morning rush hour, you'll see kids cycling to school on their own. So that becomes a lot more normalized, which gives children a lot more freedom then as they're growing up, and they get to know their environment and their local community a lot more as well.
And I suppose that's touching on another aspect, because with dereliction, we've ended up covering, I suppose, all aspects. But I suppose, again, sadly, with what's happened the last week around the idea of safety, I mean, you know, there's parts of Cork City that are particularly unsafe because of dereliction, you know, and likewise, there's lots of routes like for cycling, walking, which are not safe either. So it becomes
every empty home in a city means one less door to knock on if you're in trouble. And especially like dereliction doesn't necessarily make the place less safe, but it does add to a sense of that it's not safe. So there's particular areas of the city that there's blocks and blocks of derelict sites that are waiting for large scale development that no one goes into at nighttime. Even during the day, they can be quite if you're on your own, like nerve-wracking walking through, because you just don't know what's, you know, there's not enough people on the streets.
And it can demoralize communities. It means like you're not going to put the same effort then into, you know, doing your front of your place up or with flowers or plants if, you know, it's going to be detracted from because right next door, you know, it's just falling apart. We were talking there a bit about the kind of short-term things that could be done, but just in you know, beyond that or the long term, what else do you think needs to be done to tackle vacancy there?
I suppose in the like, so we should use everything we currently have, all the powers we currently have, and then after that there's things like the like we need to bring in and enforcement of like good Airbnb regulations as well, to make sure that there isn't a lot of vacant homes that are used for tourists instead of being used for homes. But things also like a vacancy tax that we've heard a lot about over the last year or two, that we need. It works in other countries. Like in France, vacancy tax brought about 13% of their vacant homes back into use. It's been shown to work. In the UK, they also have penalties. So your local taxes, like in Cardiff, it's 150% of your council tax if you've got a property that's empty for longer than 6 months or longer than a year. So these are normal measures that can be brought into place. Now, unfortunately, there's a lot of challenges because the government has promised to collect data on vacancies since 2018. Their last policy document on it ended last year, which they failed to deliver then on their data collection method. And so they've promised it again in the housing for all to collect data on vacancy. But again, that's actually failed straight away, because all they relied on was the land property tax survey that went out in November. But about 35% of people, or sorry, 18% of households didn't actually respond to that. So they don't have full data. Again, that's what they were relying on to collect data to evaluate then if there was potential for a vacant home tax, but they haven't even been able to collect the data again. So it's fallen at its first hurdle. So we do need a vacancy tax. It is proven to work, and it can be brought in quite quickly as well. That shouldn't take a long time. And then other things that could be quite quickly brought in, a town centre first policy. That's something that's been promised in the programme for government. The deadline's passed a long time ago already, and that needs to be brought in straight away with a focus then for town centres, because a lot of our dereliction and vacancy is in urban centres and in town centres all across Ireland. And so that needs to be addressed to give the proper resources to towns to tackle these issues. So other things as well that could happen. So
I mean, one of the things I suppose that one of the things we're pushing for I suppose a more strategic look at this, and then one of that is producing a much more comprehensive, holistic toolbox of measures. So we're particularly interested in compulsory sales and compulsory rental to support the compulsory purchase process, which is quite slow. And around that as well, we're particularly interested in taking a far stronger custodianship approach. So I think for us, when we look at this in toolbox, we've got our usage, element to it. Yeah. And, we've got a custodian element and stuff, and we got our ownership element as well. So we kind of look at it under three different things. So it's very much, at the moment, there are really good measures in place that should be applied, but really at this stage, let's produce a toolbox, which is far more comprehensive. And obviously that can be a mix, obviously, of carrots and sticks, of course. But I think at the moment, it's a bit too haphazard. And so I think different local authorities seem to be doing things their own way and not taking an overall approach across the country. So as a result, we're all losing out.
Yeah, and the last government provided funding for a full-time vacant homes officer in each local authority. And most local authorities took the money, gave the title to someone who was already plenty of work to do, and this was added on. And 3 of the local authorities actually employed a full-time vacant homes officer. So having just one person in your local authority working on that wouldn't be enough at all. Absolutely. In fact, most of them simply took the money and don't even have one full-time person.
Well, and that's it. And we have to recognise that in Ireland, there's a lot less funding devolved down to a local authority level. Yeah. Look at comparison across Europe. And so, again, like we understand from a local authority point of view, like you said, that they, for us on the outside looking in, there is a budget for a vacant home officer, and we all would assume that there's someone applied full time, and then there isn't, But I think that's why we need a much better overall approach, and it should be a lot easier for them. So if every local authority agrees to get the dereliction register, to start charging the dereliction taxes, to really implement that, and that's a nationwide approach, you could see change could happen really, really quickly.
Yeah, so what we'd also like to see on that level then is a one-stop shop, and that's probably across departmental in local authorities. So would involve a vacant homes officer, would involve a planner, would involve someone from building control,
heritage,
some from heritage, some from community development. So a team of people who know their area inside out, who know the buildings inside out, and who knows then when owners come in and they go, okay, you've got a derelict, or if they go to an owner, you've got a derelict or vacant property, especially if it's an older property that they can work with them then to find the solutions that work best for that property and that owner, whether that's selling it, renting it, renovating it, or looking at other uses, or maybe transferring it from commercial into residential uses. So that support is actually easily available for everyone then.
Yeah, and I think that is an obstacle for a lot of people. It can be done, but dealing with all the different people in a council and trying to get all those different bits of information can be very off-putting for people. as well. Now, when you were actually at the Oireachtas Housing Committee, you said, well, look, we did it and we were well able to do it, and it probably isn't as difficult as people might imagine, but still, why make it, why have hurdles in front of people when you could just, streamline it a bit.
And because,
friendly. Yeah.
And for us, it's quite different because, like I said, our professional backgrounds are in sustainability and, stuff. So we're used to working with policy people and stuff. So it is quite different. And I think, it also leads into the fact, another big challenge around that, and we found this ourselves with our own home in Cork, is that there is a lack of knowledge around materials, about renovation. Like we've an old property, it's 200 years old. We're slowly, very, very, very slowly doing it up ourselves. But trying to get the knowledge around the materials, for example, using lime or breathability or whatever it is, it's very hard to get the skills. And I think for a lot of people, that is very off-putting.
And I think one of the challenges of that is the likes of the BRE standards don't recognize the difference between these older traditional buildings. So about 16% of our housing stock is what's considered building with traditional materials, so like stone or brick walls. And for most of our towns and urban centres, these are probably the vacant and derelict properties. In our study in Cork City, we found a majority of the derelict properties were actually traditional built buildings, so nearly over 100 years old, or built before the 1940s. Now they work, unfortunately, our BRE energy rating systems don't take in some of the energy efficiency measures that can be applied to old buildings that are maybe like insulated shutters, or don't take in the fact that the buildings themselves kind of work as a heat storage during the day and then release it slowly at nighttime. So they're actually more efficient in the way they're construction often than a 1970s or a 1980s building. So we often have misconceptions that they're dark, they're cold or damp, or cold homes, but actually if they're managed properly, our home, because it's quite small as well, our home here is often warmer than our parents' 1970s, 80s built, because they're designed and built at a time when energy was really expensive, so they had to make sure that they would last.
But I mean, like for us, we've had to find that out by researching and by living the experience, by being here through the winters and realizing how it works. So we've actually gone but like for a lot of people, like we've taken that slow process. That's okay for us because we're kind of into this type of thing, and we understand for a lot of people it's a nightmare. And we don't have kids, so I can imagine if your kids it wouldn't work, or but like, so what we would like is for that kind of learning that people like us are going through, that other people wouldn't have to go through it themselves each time, that there's somewhere that someone could come in and say, guys, this is what you can do, this is what will work, and that advice comes from some like one-stop shop.
Because we often have to go to the UK reports and information to find out, because we have similarly built buildings, that we actually can find a lot of useful information from UK reports or publications than we can from in Ireland. So it's just getting that wider knowledge out there that we can do a lot with existing old buildings. Because
for us, again, I suppose on the sustainability, you mentioned the start there as well, like the most sustainable building is existing, but also the materials within the building are very, very important. So from our point of view, the more that we can retain within the building, the better. Whereas obviously, like a lot of builders will tell you, oh, take it all out, gut it all, everything has to be new, and look, that's the way they're used to working, and like I come from my family was builders, so I understand that. So but from our perspective, it's like if we can retain as much as we can, and we've been surprised how much we can retain, but again, you need someone to talk to about that. Like a one-stop shop would be wonderful, but also to give you the confidence that you're making the right decisions, that you don't have to do the research for weeks and weeks and still not be quite sure if you're making the right decision. And so I think all of that will help turn around the dereliction and vacancy, particularly the dereliction.
Okay, thanks. So I'm going to run through a few of the questions that have come in from people. If people have other questions, please pop them in, and then might come back to a couple of other points just before we finish. So just firstly, Bill Clear asks, it says there's a derelict property beside the courthouse. How does he find out who owns it? And look, obviously that should be the job of a vacant homes officer in a council. That's exactly what they should be doing, is trying to find out who owns it, following up with them, talking to them, seeing what are their plans, seeing, you know, putting it on the derelict sites register. If it isn't, if it's derelict, if it's just vacant, talking to them about, you know, do you want to rent it out? What do you want to do, or whatever? And that's actually where the idea of the compulsory sales orders or compulsory rental orders that happen in some other countries are really, really good, because that option of the compulsory purchase order here, yeah, it's bureaucratic, it takes time, and ultimately the council actually has to get the money to buy the building and then renovate it or sell it on or whatever it is. So it's fairly cumbersome if you're trying to deal with a whole load of you know, vacant or derelict properties. Whereas the compulsory sales order that they have, like for example in Scotland, means that the local authority can say, right, you're not doing anything with the building, it's perfectly good, it needs to be put into use, you don't intend to do anything to do with the building, so this order means you have to sell it, you have to put it out of the market now, and then someone can buy it to live in it or rent it out or whatever it is. But it moves it on, and it's a little less cumbersome for the local authorities. And again, the rental orders in some other countries as well, that's the same idea, that you're not renting it out, you're leaving it sitting there, you have to rent it out. And I think some of the Barcelona, with some of the bigger landlords with multiple properties, have said to them, if you leave these vacant and is it for more than 3 months or something, we'll take them from you and we're going to rent them out at a much lower social and affordable rent. So certainly could be done with some of the very large landlords here, who don't reduce rents, because they're just trying to keep up these kind of high-end rents. So having those different policy options would be really, really useful. It means you could quickly move through these things. But sorry, just on, how do people find out ownership? It can be quite difficult, can't it?
It can actually be impossible if an owner doesn't want to be found in Ireland. That there are, unfortunately, like in most other countries, especially across Europe, there's a very they have a lot of data on their buildings, so they know when the building was built, they know what condition the building is, they know who's living there for how long, and they'll also know then who owns the building as well. So that we are severely lacking data on our built environment across all aspects of the built environment. We don't have any centralized or collection on that. So that is a major problem in Ireland. Now, we do have a land registry. So the first protocol is to look at the land registry. But that's only really for properties that have sold since 2011. So that will register the owner there. Another option is to look through if there was any old planning applications on it. That will tell you either the previous owners, mightn't tell you the current owners, but it can definitely tell you previous owners. And another option then is to ask neighbours. In Ireland, we do know quite a lot more than what's maybe in official data sets. So asking neighbours can be extremely useful to find out who.
Well, yeah, because we've actually done that. I mean, for one of the properties, for example, that Cork City Council said they couldn't find the owner. We didn't actually say this to them afterwards, but we went to find the owner straight away by knocking on the door next door. So there is ways around it. Doesn't always work, obviously, but you know, like what we found by walking around Cork, people, because I love chatting, and people will talk about it and stuff, and sometimes the information is there.
So also, like, the beauty of the Derelict Sites Act actually is that you can put a property on the Derelict Sites registry without knowing the owner. Councils have to undertake reasonable efforts, so everything from putting what I've just said, but also looking through the deeds, and if they exist, or putting notices on the building or in newspapers. But if they go through reasonable effort to find an owner, they can't find an owner, they can still put it on the registry. They can still put the levy, the tax, against the property, which sits then against the property. It doesn't sit against the owner. And that can sit then on the property until the property is eventually sold, and it has to be paid before a property is sold. But councils can also go and do a full CPO of a property without ever finding out who the owner is, if it's still impossible to find the owner. So there's still a lot of...
And that's actually a very important point, because they'll often say we can't track down the owner, and the legislation allows them, as you say, if you can't find the owner, the local authority can put a notice on the building saying we're going to put it on the Derelict Sites Register, and then they can put a notice, can't they, saying that they want to CPO it. That is there, you know, if the owner is you know, and they can follow through on that. There's nothing to stop them doing that. So,
And I mean, there has been a lot of cases we've heard from other activists around Ireland and overseas where if you sometimes even by just putting up a notice, whatever, the owner turns up quite quickly. So
we've heard put up scaffolding and the owner will come out straight away, come out of the woodwork straight away if they think there's something happening with their building. But like we've heard from the I think in the press maybe coverage from the councils at times that if they do go to a CPO, that's when an owner will come forward. Even after it's on the registry, they've done other things. If they go for a CPO, then the owner will often come forward at that stage.
I know myself, that building I talked about in Parnell Square, where I was involved in the campaign around the derelict building, and the owner couldn't be found to do anything to renovate the building. But as soon as there was people using the building to try and do it up for a community space, the owner turned up very fast.
Yeah.
You know, there was no issue there at all.
Yeah.
Pretty much within 24 hours. There's a question here just about what are your thoughts about being unable to mortgage a derelict property and the barriers this causes, and could there be alternative funding available to help people who'd like to buy and renovate these properties?
Yeah, so that's it. Like when you look at the bank's websites, they say they give mortgages, and the reality is probably extremely different to that. When we were looking for a property here in Cork, most of the properties, older properties that needed even a little bit of work, not necessarily a huge amount, we're only looking for cash buyers, which I can only assume then is because they knew the banks wouldn't give a mortgage on them. So that's definitely a massive problem.
Challenge.
And so what could work in that regard is either through the credit unions, which have a huge amount of money in their deposits, so what the Netherlands have as well, they had, I don't know if they have anymore, but they had a mortgage guarantee from the local authority or the government or the local authorities. And so if you got a mortgage under a certain amount, so if we were to do this for vacant or derelict properties, if you worked with this would need to be set up, obviously it doesn't exist, but the credit unions could offer mortgage loans to homeowners to take on vacant and derelict properties. They could work with the council in a one-stop shop in the council to make sure then the people were doing the right work with the houses, a combination of probably DIY work where less skills is needed, but then bringing in the right skills. And so a big problem in Ireland, it's not just the mortgages, it's also getting good contractors that you can trust who understand older buildings. So that needs to be combined together. So it's not just about the mortgages and money, it's making sure that the right things happen to the building to bring them back into use in a good way, so to reduce the risks from both the creditors and from both the owners.
But definitely, I mean, I think it's something we both feel strongly about, that something needs to be addressed, because we need to find incentives for genuine people to be able to pick up these, like us, our property needs a lot of work and we want to pick up, we want other people to be able to access it. So yeah, definitely there is a lot of funding mechanisms that could be explored.
So one of the biggest challenges is most of these properties aren't for sale. So actually, if you went and tried to buy a vacant or derelict property, it would be impossible unless the owner is willing to sell. When we looked at a lot of old properties, some of the estate agents were it's just no point looking at it. It needs a lot of work and the owner is not willing to go down below a certain price that they knew was just too high. That people wouldn't be willing to pay it, knowing the amount of work that they'd need to do on top of it. So we need to, if we could pressurize owners to sell and reduce the price, the sales price of them, we think then it could make it hugely affordable, actually, especially first-time buyers, could make homes a lot more affordable if they worked with the likes of the credit union and their local authorities to bring these back into use. But we do believe that could be a lot more affordable option than especially comparison to a new build.
Definitely. And I think there's two things. The one, I mean, there is this kind of myth that if you're doing up an old property, it's going to be far more expensive than new. We're finding that's definitely not the case. And actually going back to, we had to do a bit of research the last few days for a project, and the feedback we're getting from people is that it is quite common that people have been trying to buy these derelict properties and they can't buy them. So there is definitely a blockage that way as well.
And because we have such a housing shortage, it means that those few derelict or vacant that do go onto the market then are going on at too high a price because it's just too much of a shortage.
Yeah, so compulsory sales orders really would help then. They'd have a huge effect, but also, as you're saying, de-risking the process by having your one-stop shops, having your supports for people.
Yeah,
obviously makes the process easier, but it's also good for lending institutions. Then it is hard for a lending institution if it's so risky here and so difficult here.
Yeah,
it then becomes a very risky loan. Whereas if this was more of a normal thing that was happening, the compulsory sale orders, there's lots of these happening.
Yeah.
And it was, you know, there was a lot more, support and information for it. All of a sudden, that's a less risky loan, isn't it?
Yeah.
Just there's a couple of questions in just about the kind of meanwhile uses and ground floor units of new developments and how you could maybe promote those in terms of community use. I know in my constituency in the newer area, Clongriffin, there's a lot of ground floor vacancy, and there is some. There's two of those units have been converted into community hubs with the city council involved and local community. It's quite good and puts a bit of life into the area, as well as the use for those units as well. There's a question about, is insurance a difficulty for the creation of meanwhile use spaces?
Yeah, I suppose we haven't looked into the insurance side a huge amount.
But it does come up. I mean,
it would be.
It's been coming up in related conversations again, some work we're doing the last few days. I suppose we'll be discussing the nighttime economy as well and stuff. And I suppose the fact that these spaces could be good for nighttime economies as well as daytime economy. But feedback we're getting is, again, it does come up. We haven't looked into it. But going back to the spaces before underneath the developments, I mean, that's something we didn't include with our studies because there was so many of those in Cork. So we tended to focus on full buildings only. But it's such an important thing because as we walk one direction from our home, which we do quite a lot, to one of our local parks, we pass so many vacant units
on new builds.
On new builds, it's almost like sometimes we almost feel like we'd be forever just taking pictures of them and stuff. So there is so many, and they would be ideal for exactly what the person asked the question.
And I suppose insurance for all walks of life in Ireland, whether it's playgrounds, community centres or play centres, unfortunately, insurance stops us really having a better quality of life here.
So there seems to be a real issue with those new builds that they're required often to have a ground floor unit that's a commercial space by the planners. Not actually, the developer's not actually interested in that space. They're building for the apartments above or whatever they're going to sell or rent, and that's what they're interested in. So they provide that ground floor space because they have to or whatever. They don't seem to have any interest in selling it, renting it. They don't seem to, there seems to be this thing as well of, well, we don't want a cheap rent in it. We'd much rather notional high rent, but no one ever pays, because then when we go to sell the scheme in 10 years time or whatever, we can claim that's a €100,000 rent, even though no one has ever paid it. I don't know. There seems to be this.
But that's very important. And like when we lived in Amsterdam, we were in, I suppose, a block of flats, and very livable flats, I must say. There was playgrounds in every corner and stuff. But underneath, you know, it was of the flats. Generally, there was a space that could be converted very easily from a retail to a home. So there's that kind of ability that you can convert, and I think that's something Ireland hasn't taken off so far, which we are advocating for, where spaces are far more adaptable and flexible and modular in terms of the usage. And I can see, you know, so it's almost like you could see the Dutch model here, but the bottom space, like you said, Cian, it's a good point actually made there, that it's not being used. Whereas in Amsterdam, they might convert it back to home for the moment, but then they go back into a shop unit again in the future.
So they're small. They build almost smaller retail units that can convert in and out of domestic into retail, where they're putting in internal partitions and stuff into it. So they're a lot more flexible. Yeah.
Flexible, yeah.
Yeah, and just I don't think we'll get to all of the questions, but just there's one here that's saying, look, are there good examples where people power and crowdsourcing? You know, in other countries, you know, has made a big difference in terms of dereliction. I suspect people in a few years' time may be looking at Ireland and saying Ireland is a good example of that, but we're not at the end result yet. But are there other countries that you think, in terms of people power around this? Sorry, I mean, you were saying earlier about Amsterdam and tackled it years ago. Amsterdam, for example, had a very big squatting movement, didn't it?
I was going to say the one thing we're missing in Ireland that is common across Europe is the squatting culture or squatting movement. So that is something that is pretty common. Like if you talk to people from Spain, Italy, Germany, Netherlands, they say, well, why aren't they squatted? You know, even squatted from families. It's not just, you know, students or people partying. It's like
friends of ours.
Squatted as homes.
Yeah, I mean, friends of ours would say that we got to know in the Netherlands earlier on in their lives, they were squatting with their families. You know, it was quite common, kids and the whole lot, you know, and that culture, because Yeah, whereas here in Ireland, I mean, rightly so, because the police or the guards come down so hard. I mean, people are just so frightened to, to squat, and like, I suppose that culture could make a huge difference.
Question here just saying that, political parties run away from the policies or regulations that are called compulsory. I quite like them then myself, but it's a fair point that yeah,
which, yeah.
But the question is kind of, what kind of car type policies can affect change in this, or, is it, commercial rates discounts, or is it grants for retrofitting they're asking, or yeah, what's your?
I think I was just looking. I think someone on Twitter shared that Barcelona, not only are they doing compulsory rental orders, but they actually give tax rebates to landlords who reduce their rents, who actually drop their rents, then they give them tax breaks. So it's not just about, it's about incentivizing the actions that you want to see. So it's things like grants to go towards, not grants to go towards the purchase of a house, but grants to actually cash grants to go towards the renovation of the houses as well. So that is something that is needed for home, especially first-time buyers who are buying a home to live in it as their home, that they get that support then. So that's it. That is other measures that can be taken.
Yeah, but like I say, it's important. No, definitely. I mean, they're right. I mean, there has to be support as well. Definitely.
So there is like the Live in Cities initiative, which is a tax rebate after you renovate an old property, but that needs probably to be expanded. It's only in certain areas of cities. That should be expanded out to the whole, really all urban areas, all towns and village centres, especially to rent pressure zones first, but it should be expanded out. You shouldn't have to prove the age of a property, and it shouldn't be in a tight, small map of locations. It should be much wider.
And because it's a tax rebate, it's not going to suit everyone. So you need to make sure it suits people from a whole range of incomes. I think that's quite important too. And I suppose the one thing we haven't spoken about is that, I mean, we have mentioned the lack of affordability, obviously, but I mean, when, again, going back from Netherlands, I mean, over 50% of accommodation in Amsterdam was social housing, and it's a scaled process. So it kind of allows people to, I suppose, pay a bit more if they're earning a bit more, and pay a bit less if they're earning less. And I think that works really well as well.
I suppose sometimes we got to be aware it's not just about the money, the tax, or the sticks either. It's about people have a lot going on in their lives, and and if they, especially if they inherited a property, or if they've mental health issues. So we were talking to an organisation a while ago in Leeds, so in the UK, where they have penalties for on your council tax for vacant properties. They take that money that they get from the local from the council tax for vacant homes, and they actually fund a local organisation then who works with the owners to go out and find a good estate agent for them, to find good tenants for them, or to find good contractors and builders to do the renovations that need to be done, because some people need an extra help, a little extra hand holding along the way. So it's not just about, it's not necessarily technical issues or financial issues. So it's just those extra supports that either could be a one-stop shop in the council, but maybe could be a separate organisation as well that actually works on a project level with each owner to find out what the problems are, and to help them through getting those properties back into use.
And that could probably bring a decent percentage of properties back in as well. So again, it's another measure. I mean, the one in Leeds seems to work really well from what they were saying. So
a couple of questions here just about dereliction and vacancy and what's the difference. One person saying that there's a house that they know has been empty for 13 years and it's in decay. Can it be included in the derelict property register? Yes, it should be, and they should report that to the council. As has been said earlier, there is that problem of the councils aren't putting on all derelict buildings that they should be, so that may need a push actually even to get the council to do that. But yes, there's a question about what's the difference between dereliction or vacancy, and that the vacant homes officer says if the house is just vacant and it's not derelict, there's nothing that they can do about it. And that currently basically is the case. That's why a tax on vacancy would be a good idea. It would actually create that incentive for people just not to leave a building vacant. And I think you've made the point, you've both made the point before, that actually if you leave a home or a building vacant for a number of years, it's likely to become derelict then, because it's not going to be lived in, it's not going to be maintained. and actually quite quickly, a really good building or a really good home can, after a year or two, vacancy can deteriorate quite quickly. So it's really important that that isn't allowed happen to our buildings.
Because we've seen that. I mean, like, because we're here long enough now, we're here over 3 years, and we started doing this when we came here in the start. So we're seeing buildings that were in a good shape a year and a half ago. Someone breaks a window, broken window material, but it's true. Like, we've seen the windows when after being broken, and then we've seen a few weeks later where something else happens. So it does happen.
It can happen quite quickly, and I suppose that distinction between what's derelict, what's vacant, so there's, I suppose, under the current legislation, derelict, like, so a dictionary definition of dereliction is generally like an abandoned house. Under the Derelict Sites Act, it's more around the impact it has on the neighborhood, so that whether it has a negative impact on the neighborhood. Now, when it comes into how data is collected and whether it's collected on vacancy or dereliction, I suppose the biggest definition changes is whether a home is habitable or inhabitable. Now, even with that, you can have variants of definition of where people live. I'm sure like their current state of our home might be considered inhabitable by many mid-construction. So that can be, that I suppose maybe the most useful distinction is, can someone live in it, or does it need a substantial amount of work on it? Now, from the street, it's not always possible to tell the difference. So there's a lot of inconsistencies with, say, Cork City Council's derelict registry, and we only know this because we noticed their registry in detail, not because in comparison to any other council. So, for instance, there's 3 or 4 properties on Cork City Council's derelict registry that from the street, when we were doing our mapping, we walked past many times and didn't think anything of them. It's only when we looked at the registry that we were like, oh, that's actually on the derelict register. And they only look from the outside, some of them don't even look empty. So there really is quite a loose definition then clearly of what is acceptable and not acceptable to go on the registry. So I suppose we definitely need, when it comes to the data collection method of what is derelict and what is vacant. But from the local authorities, they are quite loose in how they define it. Now, we would see a home, regardless of its looks, over a 5-year period, definitely anything over 10 years has a negative impact on the community, because you're lacking that neighbor, and you're lacking that community aspect to it. So that does then start to become derelict in that much more community sense, than on a material building level. So that's, I suppose, we could go around in circles forever with academic definitions of them.
Yeah, and there's about 19 questions in. I've tried to get through the guts of most of them. I don't think we'll get a chance to go through all of them, but just before we finish up, just ask you, in terms of collectively, what can we all be doing on this? What do you think is effective, or what sort of actions can we take? And there are questions in there as well saying, where's the resistance on this? Is it from the Department of Finance? Is it from local authorities? And what do you feel is the best way to kind of get change both at a national level and at a local level on this?
Well, I suppose when we started, a load of people just told us that's the way things are and just accept it. And I suppose if we had stopped at that point, obviously we'd be quite disappointed. We'd be living in a situation. So social media, I suppose, alone has been far more powerful than we would have anticipated. And I suppose like you said earlier on yourself, Cian, if everyone can take pictures, start conversations, share stories, I think the power of that alone, people would say no one looks at social media, but clearly the papers, the media all look at social media. So that creates a conversation. And so sharing, posting, contacting your local authority, asking to include on the derelict property list and stuff, that's a wonderful thing. And even though people only just do a few properties each, that would have a huge impact, I think.
Yeah, no, I think so. Like contacting local councillors or TDs, definitely, but also just or trying to register with like trying to email or whatever registration system your local council has, sometimes they can be very cumbersome, and unfortunately you don't always see much of a response a lot of the time, and so it can be quite disheartening for people. But we think definitely on social media, whether it's Facebook, Instagram, we're mostly on Twitter, but whatever platforms people use, to share it with a hashtag of Derelict Ireland, so we can all share it, then we can all see those. If anyone searches that hashtag, then they can see all the derelict properties that are going up. Or a lot of people are also sharing like Derelict Cork, Derelict Dublin, Derelict Dundalk, so hashtag with your local area as well. And then other people, and this is probably only a few people will do it, but other people have also set up separate dereliction accounts. So in Limerick, Drogheda, Sligo, 2 in Dublin, Mayo, and even as far as Yorkshire have set up derelict accounts for their local towns and local areas, then to share the dereliction around our local areas. So you don't necessarily need to go that extreme, but just even sharing images with a hashtag of.
Yeah, but I can see, I mean, you know, would say Derelict Drogheda, I mean, Dom has been active for a while, but like the last few weeks, he's been posting every day for, I think, the first 100 days. But already I can see there's a lot of conversations going around Drogheda, you know, so, and I don't know the town myself, but like I can see if everyone starts posting about the local area, I think the impact's amazing, because it becomes obviously very visual. I think it's the evidence is there, then people can see it and stuff.
Because if we just kept our reporting just directly with the council, other people wouldn't have seen it and wouldn't have shared their properties. People were getting in touch with us as well about properties in their areas. And so I suppose it's that's the social element of social media. It does, if we share, everyone shares images, that puts a lot of pressure that's out in the public then, that people can't, and local politicians and local councils and the departments as well then can't hide once those images are out there.
And I think what's useful then when you start is to, I mean, people could be far more used to social media than we are, but I mean, it's trying to get the conversations going, then to go out with the stories, to have the conversations, to have more conversations, and to listen to what people are saying. Because like we said earlier on, we did learn a lot from the feedback people gave us. And I think, you know, building up that knowledge is very, very important.
And then in terms of where those blockers are, it's not any one individual blocking anywhere. It is a systems approach that needs to be taken, and the pressure then needs to be pushed across everyone. But I suppose it's a wider cultural change as well that we need. We need to see private property rights that are important and are in our constitution, but our constitution also says they should be regulated by common good and social justice. And I suppose as a society, we're 100 years old, as a country, we need to have those discussions of actually what is important to us as a society. Is it important that everyone has a home, has an affordable home, where families can raise their children in security and without having to live paying too much in rents or mortgages, over the ability for not everyone, but for some people to speculate. And that's the problem at the moment, is that some people are allowed to speculate at no cost to them, with their value of their properties going up constantly, while others are suffering. And I suppose as a society, we need to have those discussions. Is that the society we want?
Yeah, and likewise, if people are kind of wondering, feel free to contact us. We've helped other groups set up, and hopefully other people will be doing more festivals. I know you joined in Dublin, Cian, so more walking festivals, and you know, anything that brings it to it. And also more meanwhile use, taking spaces over, you know. And I suppose really it's about reaching communities that haven't been engaged so far, you know, all ages, all backgrounds, because this affects everyone, and we're going to have far better Ireland if we can tackle this dereliction epidemic and provide homes and places to play and create for everyone. I mean, it would just make an amazing difference to our country.
That's absolutely brilliant, Jude and Frank. Thank you very much for sharing your time with us and sharing all that experience. And I think what you're saying there to people, get active yourself. Don't just do this in terms of, yeah, you can report a derelict property to your local council, whatever, but do this in a visible way, post it on social media, involve people, get a conversation going. That's much more, that can be really, really effective. And then you're not just doing this on your own, because you're doing it with everybody else in the country who's doing something. So if that means taking an interest in one building that's derelict in your area and doing that, great. If you can do more than one building, better again. But if we can all do a little bit on this, we'll really really
And like Jude said there, like it's good to, like, if you think it's derelict, hashtag Derelict Ireland or derelict whatever place, location you live in. And if you're not quite sure, you could always just, but you know it's vacant, hashtag Vacant Ireland. Do you know what I mean? Because sometimes I know people are a bit unsure and they don't want to say it's derelict if it's not derelict. So we tend to go for hashtag Derelict Ireland mostly, but also would include Vacant Ireland as well if there's a bit of a lack of clarity. Because I know, like when we were posting the properties for the year, like we were under a lot of pressure because we'd go back loads of time before we post a property because we didn't want to put properties where someone was living in or someone was squatting in and stuff, whatever. So we went back over and over again. And I think you will feel a bit of pressure because it's not like you're trying to pick out that particular individual. Like I said, you're trying to shine a light on a national level. It's something that we can change nationally.
And one point of lessons learned the hard way here as well is to make sure your location is on when you're taking your images, so it's recorded on the image if you ever want to go back to it. We learned that the hard way.
That's a good tip. We won't all be doing on the scale that you're doing it though. So, but yeah, that's a good tip. So thanks a million.
No problem, guys.
And thanks to everyone who participated this evening. So we all just need to go out there and get taking photos and get putting them up and join in this campaign. So that's brilliant. And
thank you.
Thank you so much.
Cheers.
Thanks for everyone who tuned in.